Well, good afternoon, everybody, coming up to us on Wavy.com and also on the Wavy Facebook page. I'm Jason Marks here with Wavy TV, and once again, we're here on a Friday afternoon, and that means we're talking about the Patients vs. Perwaiz. If you don't know what the Patients vs. Perwaiz is, it's our year-long investigation into Dr. Javed Perwaiz, a Chesapeake OB/GYN who was convicted in November in federal court of doing unnecessary surgeries simply to line his own pockets. Now, this latest chapter, we start looking at money. The federal government told the jury during his federal trial that this was all about money. Javed Perwaiz's greed is the reason why he did all these surgeries and all these unnecessary diagnostic procedures. Now, so we looked at money, we looked at where he was spending his money. Here's a sneak peek of what you'll see right now on Wavy.com for Chapter 8.
The overall scheme was to get money for himself, to which he was not entitled. However, there are different aspects of that scheme, such as the lying on the sterilization consent forms, falsifying estimated delivery dates for women to ensure that he was the one to deliver the babies at the hospital and get that money, to scaring patients into thinking they had cancer, and then the fake colposcopy and hysteroscopies that were going on in his office, and they were complete fabrication.
It's a production line. If you have more patients, you get more money back.
The FBI says just alone in the last 7 years, he made $7 million off of surgeries like the one on Anita. And it wasn't just surgeries he made money from. It was also all of those diagnostic procedures.
I saw the money he made. I saw the vehicles he bought. And I knew that, obstetrics could be lucrative back then, but I mean, he always had a brand new expensive car. And then he bought a beautiful house.
Perwaiz liked nice things, including nice cars. He had at least 5 of them when he was arrested, like this 2014 $127,000 black Mercedes-Benz, or his $139,000 Mercedes-Benz, or how about his $212,000 Bentley? Prosecutors also point out all the purchases Perwaiz made over the past 9 years, like spending more than $63,000 at QVC.
And today we're bringing it to you at a price that only we can do for you today here at QVC.
And Javed Perwaiz spent a lot on QVC, and he spent a lot other places. And we're going to talk about some of the other places that he spent money on, including how much the hospitals made off of his surgeries here in the area. I want to bring in my colleagues now. Adrian Mayfield, good to see you. And then there's Kevin Rahm, who is the editor and the photographer, the genius behind all of this. And Adrian, we start getting into money, and obviously this is the crux of what the federal prosecutors told the jury. They said he did all these things. It was all about greed. And when you look at the numbers, he lived a very lavish lifestyle.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the prosecutor, Beth Usey, really said it best when she said everything comes together, the lies to the patients, to the insurance companies, and it shows that he was really trying to make as much money possible by whatever means necessary. I think I was most surprised by the expenses that I didn't expect. Like, Jason, $70,000 on luxury sunglasses and almost $20,000 buying one of his nurses luxury watches. And I think those types of expenses are just so outside of the realm of what, an average person might even dream of spending their money on. So when I saw he was able to spend all of that money, but not only spend it all, but kind of overspend too.
Yeah.
He spent a little bit more than he should have compared to what he was making, and he was making a lot.
Well, you talk about it. I think that the federal government decided that they did all the math, and $7 million in the last 7 years is what he made and put in his pocket, put in his wallet. And we looked at it. The average OB/GYN makes about $250,000 a year. So obviously, he had he was making a ton of money, and he was spending on. And let's just run over some of the expenses right here. I printed them out right before we came out here. And so he spent, this is his town-baked checking account, $82,000 in 7 years at Harris Teeter. It's a lot of groceries.
It's a lot.
Churchland's Village Flower Shop, $16,800. 7-Eleven, he made 215 purchases for $11,800. We talked about QVC. This is now American Express. $38,000 at QVC, and that was 183 purchases on QVC. So it wasn't just, I mean, he was spending a lot at QVC. 14,000 at Nordstrom. Now we go to his Bank of America. 14,000 at Louis Vuitton. 8,000 at Burberry. $7,000 at Sunglass Hut. So you see a pattern here. He liked nice things. Bank of America, another credit card. Sunglass Hut, $30,000. QVC, another 22. Louis Vuitton, 16,000. Burberry, 11. Harris Teeter, another $10,000 at Harris Teeter. What's he buying? Caviar at Harris Teeter. Solstice sunglasses, 6,000. And then you go to his Capital One credit card, and Neiman Marcus catalog, $209,000. You look at lastcall.com, which is a Neiman Marcus product, another $200,000. Neiman Marcus, $131,000. Neiman Marcus online, $43,000. And Neiman Marcus book, $32,000. That's well over, I think, if you do the math, $600,000, Kevin, just in the last 7 years at a clothing store.
Yeah, it's really crazy to think about. I mean, it makes you realize, I mean, how far $7 million really goes. I mean, and we haven't even brought up the cars yet.
Yep.
I mean, that's a whole nother beast, is the cars that he had. I mean, you saw the two Mercedes and the Bentley. I mean, it's just insane. The QVC is really, I think, what really stood out to us, and the amount of purchases he was making. It's like he was buying a lot of blenders. He must have the garages full of blenders and all kinds of other QVC-esque items, and I'm sure he bought a lot of clothing there for some of his the nurses that work for him as well. And so, I mean, it's literally pages and pages of those kinds of transactions that he made. And I think what stood out to me the most in Chapter 8 was when Ed Compton, the juror, kind of explained it, and he was specifically talking about Margot Stone and how she was making a lot of money off of the surgeries, just like Perwaiz was, because Perwaiz was feeding a lot of money to her and her children. And he said that, Ed Compton said that, you know, she and her children were almost living off of the blood of these women, of these surgeries, and that really hit home to me. I'm not sure how you guys took that, but that one really stood out to me.
I mean, he was obviously a juror. He obviously, Adrian, was in that jury room after sitting in a 5-week trial and then deliberating it. And this is something that they looked at. Margot Stone, just to give you a little bit of background here, if you haven't been watching this as it unfolded, this investigation, Margot Stone was a longtime employee. She was the only nurse that worked with him, the only one who had medical training. And she talked about during her testimony and during trial how she made hundreds of thousands of dollars, or he gave her hundreds of thousands of dollars. He helped pay for her two children's high school, private school, and helped put them through college. And the one note, Adrian, when we featured Margot Stone in this last chapter, was because the fact she took immunity from the federal government, meaning she testified for him so she would not face prosecution.
Yeah, absolutely. Prosecutor Elizabeth Yusi said that Margot Stone was the only registered nurse who was working with Perwaiz for much of his time in practice. She was medically trained, unlike some of his other employees who maybe had some medical education, but only were medically trained in his office. So those employees maybe didn't fully understand the scope of the problems in the office. But Margot Stone, according to Elizabeth Yusi, she most certainly did. She watched Perwaiz do examinations incorrectly. She watched him change information. And so she did take immunity. She was a witness against Perwaiz. She talked about the things that she witnessed that were wrong. And in court, they talked about the ways that she benefited from that. And the juror, Ed Compton, he said that really bothered the jury, because it's one thing for Perwaiz to be earning money off of legitimate surgeries, and if he wants to spend it at QVC or Neiman Marcus, that's okay. But Margot Stone should have been a check to the balance, according to the jury. I mean, she was another person in that office who they felt should have known what was going on, and she really benefited. And I also just wanted to put out that this pattern of spending wasn't new. Jason, we found a lawsuit in Portsmouth from several decades ago where Perwaiz settled some debt with Neiman Marcus. So he's enjoyed shopping there for a long time.
Yeah, it's, you know, you talk to the patients, and it's just, they still can't wrap their heads around it even today. You you know, this guy's a doctor. He's going to make money to begin with. So why did he have to do what he did just to make extra money? He was going to live a nice lifestyle as an OBGYN. $250,000, the average OBGYN salary. That's a lot of money. So very strange. And when we talk about Margot Stone, it's, you know, they were in a relationship for an off and on relationship for many, many years, according to prosecutors. And, you know, Dr. Perwaiz had 2 pictures that hung on the walls. And some of the patients told us that those pictures, Dr. Perwaiz would say those were his children. Well, it turns out they were Margot Stone's children. So it's very strange there. And then to tie this all together, when you look at Margot Stone, in January, we mentioned this on a couple of Facebook Lives, maybe last month, that federal prosecutors took Dr. Perwaiz back to court in January to seize some of his assets because they got wind that he was selling off some of the assets. One of those assets was a Mercedes-Benz Roadster that 2 days after his conviction, he sold to Margot Stone's son for $1. And so, I mean, you know, there's still connection there, even after she went ahead and testified for the prosecution against her old boss.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that the fact that he was selling his assets from behind bars has been really shocking to some of the patients that we've talked to. They don't really understand how that's happened. Now, obviously, the federal government has put a stop to that because there is going to be some financial liability here. And, you know, given that he's no longer able to practice, I imagine a lot of that is going to be paid off in his assets. And he has a very nice home in Chesapeake, you know, at his time of arrest, 5 luxury cars, and this was way before they really got into the meat of it. But just at the time of his arrest, prosecution estimated he had about $200,000 just in like rare art and gold in the house.
Yeah, he's got a lot of assets, and there's stock options, and there's a lot there.
Kevin, the ownership with Harborview.
Sure, yeah, we can get into Harborview if you want. I mean, we talked about. We talked about Chesapeake Regional in a previous chapter and how much money he made for the hospital. And the federal government says he made, based on surgeries alone for Chesapeake Regional, this is surgeries and deliveries, because Chesapeake Regional is also a place where you can go to deliver baby. Harborview is not. And he made $18 million for the hospital alone. Well, Harborview is a place where, as soon as it opened, Dr. Perwaiz started doing surgeries at the surgery center there in Suffolk. And he was doing them every Friday, and then as the last couple years, he was doing them every other Friday. But we talked about how it was chaotic when the patients would arrive. They would all arrive at the same time. Nurses called it a Perwaizathon, which we've heard in a previous chapter. It stuck with the jury, that name. And the interesting thing in all this is that Harborview, Bon Secours, made $3 million off of this. And this was one of those places where the nurses went to supervisors and said, hey, something's wrong here. He's doing way too many surgeries, and nothing ever changed. And, you know, I think in this chapter, we reached out to Bon Secours. You'll see that we reached out to them over and over again. And a lot of the other, whether it's the other places we reached out to, whether it was the businesses, whether it was Optima, or whether it was Chesapeake Regional, they send us a formal email, essentially a response saying, hey, here is our response. But Harborview, Bon Secours, I got it in a text message, which is very unheard of.
Yeah, I know you called me when you got the text, and it was a little bit shocking for you.
Shocking.
Yeah, the informality of it, and also just that after all of the testimony that we heard, that there would be no formal statement. I think, too, one thing that you did really well in this chapter in writing it is showing the reporting process. And for those of you watching at home, Jason was very diligent about giving people a lot of time to respond to these allegations. He actually started contacting Bon Secours last year in 2020, far beyond the trial, and we were given a very short statement at that point. But the interesting thing, as we went to find out, was they didn't mention that he was a part owner, and he owned a very small percentage of the hospital. But Jason, you can shed more light on how that came to be.
Well, that was in February 2020 when we first reached out to them, and then they gave us that initial statement.
Right.
And then we were, in our investigation, we were focused on Chesapeake Regional, because all of our patients that we were testifying that we're interviewing, Kevin, seemed like they were all coming from Chesapeake Regional or had surgeries there. And then when we got to the trial, it seemed like, and I remember coming to you in the car and going, man, Bon Secours, Harborview, they are right in the center of this, because the first like 4 days of the trial, we're talking about that surgery center over and over and over again. And so after the trial is when I sent them a list of questions, asking them about the stuff that we learned from the trial. And then, of course, Kevin, then I got the text message from them.
Yeah, I mean, and how it all played out in terms of how Perwaiz ended up getting the part ownership is really interesting to me. And I mean, it was up to them to leave that out when they were giving us those statements, but it's almost like he used his ability to give surgeries for the hospital and make them money as leverage to kind of squeeze in to be like, hey, I want to be a part owner in the hospital, so if you're not going to make that happen, I'm going to have to take my business elsewhere. And apparently they felt the need that they needed to give him that part ownership, and even though it was only, it's 1%, I mean, he's still a part owner of the surgery center, and it almost seemed like he kind of strong-armed him there a little bit to get to become that part owner, and just kind of said, hey, you could either do what I say, or I'm gonna take my shop elsewhere.
Yeah.
And it's unfortunate that something like that can happen in the medical field.
And when you say 1%, that's worth $40,000. So it's a nice chunk of change. I mean, it's $40,000.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the thing about that,
that's his QVC budget.
Yeah, I mean, right. It's more pillows. I mean, the thing about this that is like shocking about that, when we learn in court that he's part owner of Bon Secours, is meaning that he's got skin in the game now, right? I mean, he's doing surgeries there, and the more surgeries he's doing there, obviously the more money he's making, but he's also making more money for the center, the same center that he is part owner of.
Right, and when you look at it, I mean, compared to what he made for Chesapeake Regional, around $18 million, and you hear, oh, he only made $3 million over at Harborview. Well, you have to understand, he wasn't operating at Harborview as often. He wasn't delivering babies there, and that's $3 million that he had a personal financial investment in. So that Harborview can't be ignored in this, and I think the prosecution did focus very heavily on Harborview because there were nurses there who reported it.
And that's a big point, Adrian, the fact that he didn't deliver babies at Harborview, so that number is going to be down. Plus, Harborview is only a surgery center. That's a day surgery center where you don't go overnight. You go in, you get your surgery, you go home, outpatient surgery. And so obviously the more major surgeries, the hysterectomy and things like that, you're not going to go to a Harborview. You're going to go to a Chesapeake instead.
Right.
So that's something to remember. Kevin, we don't want to forget about obviously the patients who drove this bus for us and who were the reason behind all these surgeries. And you mentioned Ed Compton, the juror, talking about on the blood of the patients, of the blood of the women. And one of them that we talked to in this chapter was Anita Fuller, who actually testified in the trial against Dr. Perwaiz. And she had, I mean, for me, it was one of our most heartbreaking stories. Can you just go ahead and tell the people here about Anita Fuller and about how shocking that was when you heard how she learned that she had also been gotten by Dr. Perwaiz?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we talked to Anita, like you said, it didn't take very long for us to realize just how hurt she was by what Dr. Perwaiz had done, because she came in for a routine checkup with Dr. Perwaiz, and he said, you know, look, Anita, like you have cancer, and I think like a lot of us, we all have a personal connection to people that have had cancer, and for her, it was very close to home. Her husband had died of cancer about 4 or 5 years earlier, and so as soon as she heard that, knowing the severity of cancer and what that can do to families and lives, she was like, you know, I mean, without hesitation, yes, whatever you need to do to get the cancer out of me and to make sure that I don't have to go through any of that and to put our family through anything like that ever again. I mean, I couldn't even imagine what it was like for her to be sat down by the FBI and eventually told that, you know, you don't have cancer actually. And she told us in that moment that she heard that, her reaction, and it's really upsetting. It's really chilling to have to think about what that moment was like for her to have that realization that everything that he had told her was just a complete lie, and he used cancer as somebody that holds that word very close to her as somebody that she lost a life partner to it. And so he used that as a tool to get more money from the insurance companies, and it's really, I know, made a really big impact on her life, and it's really sad. It's definitely one of the saddest stories that we've heard throughout our investigation.
We talked to Anita today again, and you can tell. I mean, she, you know, I mean, these patients, obviously, when you find something like that out, I mean, it's got a lasting effect, and that's why federal prosecutors, along with local therapists, set up this collaborative they got going on right now, where there's resources on wavy.com. If for any of you patients, if you're a patient or you know someone who's a patient who might be dealing with PTSD or having a hard time still coming to grips with what happened, that there's services available that if you need to talk to someone. Anita's one of those patients also who is looking at filing a lawsuit against Dr. Perwaiz. She has an attorney, and that's in the process. But obviously that's easier said than done, and that's going to be the focus of Chapter 10, I believe, where we're going to go to lawsuits. But we should start transitioning right now into Chapter 9. So hard to believe, we're at Chapter 9 right now. And Chapter 9 really, I think, Adrian, is the crux of why we did this project. And it's really starting to look at, were there red flags? We know there were, but trying to determine if there was one person who dropped the ball.
Yeah, absolutely. I think when we sat down and started discussing our reporting, that was the first thing that we talked about. We said, who dropped the ball here? How did this go on for so long? And at that point, we didn't even really know the scope of the red flags. We just knew what the federal government was saying, and that really covered a very limited amount of time. And we've shared before in Facebook Lives that it was the first day that we were interviewing where we met a patient who had filed a complaint with the Virginia Board of Medicine. It didn't take long at all for us to identify red flags that went far beyond the scope of the FBI's investigation and the prosecutor's case. So in Chapter 9, we're going to take you through all of those red flags. We're going to show you what happened when we attempted to talk to the Virginia Board of Medicine. We're going to bring in a past medical board member who's going to respond in a kind of, frankly, a surprising way to some of this information. And we're going to just tell you more about what experts say about these holes. I don't know if holes is the right word, but these loopholes that allow these things to happen in the medical field. And in their opinion, this is an egregious case, but it's not the only case of a doctor performing procedures or acting inappropriately. They say it's vastly underreported, and although Perwaiz is egregious, it wasn't surprising to them that something like this could happen and could carry on for years.
Yeah, unfortunately, we've heard of these sort of stories before. There's
Absolutely.
Dr. Death podcast. It's a good podcast about doctors who have done terrible things, and so unfortunately, this happens, and it probably happens far too often than it should. You're all right about the former board member, what he was talking about and what some of the board actions were when we talk about the 1980s when Dr. Perwaiz had his privileges revoked from Maryview for doing unnecessary hysterectomies. I mean, Kevin, pretty shocking what he says. I mean, it's kind of a tease, right, into Chapter 9.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, he definitely sheds a lot of light on the process and how things have changed from not only when he was a board member, but back in the 80s when a lot of the slaps on the wrist were given to Dr. Perwaiz, where this could have been stopped in his tracks, but unfortunately he was he just kind of slid under the radar. They gave him a slap on the wrist, and it was almost like they gave him strike 1, strike 2, strike 3, strike 4, and I mean, ultimately, it took until 2019, unfortunately, for him to be called out by the FBI. But yeah, it's incredibly interesting how he really just slid through the cracks over the years, and it's hard to really have an answer for that one person or that one entity where you could say, okay, this is who dropped the ball, and it's just not that simple, unfortunately.
Yeah, and Dr. Perwaiz was scheduled to be sentenced next week. If you haven't heard by now, that sentencing has been delayed to mid-May. And what also has been extended because of that sentencing being delayed is the time you're allowed, if you're a patient and you want to send in a victim impact statement to the federal government, if you want to let the federal government know how Dr. Perwaiz impacted your life, they would like to hear from you. We have all that information for you on wavy.com, but that period now has been extended into May, and they're really hoping that they can get as many victim impact statements as they can, because they really want to hear from everyone who believes that Dr. Perwaiz impacted their lives. So Chapter 9, that will come out a week from yesterday, so next Thursday at midnight it will come out. And Chapter 8, guys, is online right now on wavy.com. Any other thoughts about Chapter 8 before we call it a day here?
I have to say, it was, for me, as a person who enjoys consuming true crime, it was one of my favorite chapters, because I think it answered a lot of questions for me about the why. And we've spent a lot of time in this series telling you about the what and what he did, and this answers the why. And prosecutors firmly believe that this was financially motivated. And I also just want to go back to what you said, Jason, and just you know, encourage, if you feel that you've been impacted and you feel that you need a resource, we have this information about the Women's Collaborative and information about those victim impact statements online at wavy.com. The collaborative is doing everything they can to make sure that their services are free or cost effective, and they're really eager to help people. You do not have to be a patient who has ever spoken publicly. You don't have to be a patient who testified.
Nope.
The federal government has done a good job of acknowledging that the scope of this problem is wide-reaching, and so that door is open to you when you're ready.
Yeah, and it's, I mean, we're going to get into that in Chapter 10 when we've talked to the therapist already, and you're going to see them in Chapter 10 in 2 weeks. But obviously for the FBI, they know there could be thousands of women out there who are dealing with some sort of PTSD or some sort of trauma.
Yeah.
Thank you for that word. Dealing with this, and trauma is a great word for it. And it's not just the obviously physical scars, but it's the emotional ones that they're dealing with. And so they reached out to therapists, and it's available there, and they're hoping to at some point, you know, do obviously they had the one-on-one counseling going on right now, but they're hoping to get some group sections where they have these Perwaiz patients who can all gather in a room and talk together, because unfortunately they all share a bond that none of them ever wanted to have. But that's the reality of the situation.
Yeah,
so
people can take their time too, because as the therapist shared with us, sometimes something happens, and maybe it takes a little while to set in. So they're going to be here for the long haul. They're, you know, here whenever you're ready.
Yeah, it could take years before you realize that there's some sort of trauma. So that's in Chapter 10. Chapter 8, as we mentioned, and along with 1 through 7 are on wavy.com right now, along with all those other resources. That's it, guys. I don't have anything else for the day. Are we good?
Ready to go outside and enjoy the warm weather and the sun.
We're all good.
I think.
The wind, right? The wind.
Feels good out there.
Kevin's starting, if you can see behind him, Kevin's starting to edit Chapter 9, which is really, I think, an important one. It really starts to tie in all the red flags. We sort of, what we did is we tried to sprinkle those red flags for you throughout the first 8 chapters, and that way we didn't want to bombard and put all the red flags into one chapter, but we will in this chapter list them for you throughout the first 7, and then we asked the former board member, hey, who do you think dropped the ball? And you'll hear what he has to say. That's in Chapter 9. And of course, next Friday we'll be back here at 1:15 to talk about Chapter 9 and answer any of your questions. We'll see you later. Bye.
Bye.